What started as a routine Senate hearing quickly turned into a tense confrontation after Senator Chris Coons pressed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth over millions of dollars in delayed Ukraine aid that Congress already approved months ago. But as Coons kept pushing for direct answers, the hearing exposed something much bigger, a growing divide inside Washington over NATO, Ukraine, and America's role on the global stage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in January, President Trump signed the fiscal year 26 defense appropriations bill. It provided $400 million specifically to aid Ukraine in their fight against Russia. This is at a time when our European allies and partners have stepped up to take on the overwhelming majority of the cost of any munitions or support for Ukraine. So far, your department has not spent a dime of that $400 million, despite repeated follow-up requests from the chairman and myself. In a call just last week, your staff indicated we will see a spend plan for those funds this week. Will you commit to spending those $400 million for weapons for Ukraine, and when will we receive your department's spend plan?
I appreciate that question. The $400 million for European capacity building has been released from the Secretary of War's office, and we'll work with EUCOM to make sure they spend it accordingly and properly, which we have all faith that they will.
Mr. Secretary, when will this subcommittee get the associated spend plan for the $400 million?
Yeah, I mean, we will work with your committee to make sure that the spend plan as allocated, I want to make sure EUCOM is fully informed in how they want to spend this. They're the closest to the problem set. And so working with them to ensure that you have the spend plan, we'll work with you.
Mr. Secretary, thank you, but it's May, and this has been the law since January, and you or your representatives have been asked this repeatedly on a bipartisan basis by members of this committee. And I think dragging our feet on this small investment in Ukraine's defense sends exactly the wrong signal to Putin at a time when the contest for freedom has its front lines in Ukraine. As you said, Europe has stepped up, donating billions to buy U.S. weapons to send to Ukraine to help them as they continue to take ground on the battlefield. But it seems not all the money donated by our European allies is going to buy new weapons for Ukraine, as they had understood. The memo you released just last week, prior to your testimony at Senate Armed Services, indicated DOD has and will continue to divert some of these funds back into DOD accounts for our own use. Will you commit, Mr. Secretary, to spend every dollar donated by our European allies for Ukraine on new weapons and capabilities for Ukraine?
The Pearl Initiative, which you're referring to, which is instituted underneath this administration so that European countries are paying for American equipment to provide as they see fit. NATO allocates where it would like to allocate that. It can choose Ukraine if it'd like. That money, when it's paid for, that's where it goes. It goes to those efforts.
Well, look, as the chairman raised, and as I will repeat, I view NATO as the most successful mutual defense relationship we've ever had. And your comment about we need not flags, but real and capable allies, and the foot dragging on both Pearl and the investments in our Baltic allies and Ukraine causes me real concern. As you know, a bipartisan group of us from the Senate and the House went to Denmark to lay a wreath at the memorial to the 52 Danes who served, fought, and died alongside our troops in Afghanistan. Those were not just flags. Those were real warfighters who fought and died at our request in a war that began by NATO's initiation, a service and sacrifice in Afghanistan. I just think we're sending the wrong signal by the president's announcement of the intention to withdraw 5,000 troops from Germany. Could you help me understand what is the strategic reason for a drawdown of U.S. troops from Western Europe?
I would just like to clarify, Senator, it's never about the heroism of foreign troops. I fought alongside great British and European and Australian allies in Afghanistan. It's the political caveats and the limitations that they come with. It's not the troops. It's the capitals of those militaries that limit what they're able to do, where they're able to go, who they're able to fight, that create limits on our own. And anybody that's been in these formations knows that. So it's easy to talk about here. It's another thing to apply. And we need allies that are burden sharing, not becoming a burden with political limitations. I'm not talking about the troops.
Thank you. Our president said in Europe that we never asked for and never received anything from our NATO allies. Was that your experience in Afghanistan, serving and fighting alongside our NATO allies?
I've written extensively about that, and the vast majority of my experience was frustration with the limits of what those troops were able to do because of the political caveats, rules of engagement, and limits that came from their
capitals. But you don't doubt or question that about a third of all the combat casualties in our war in Afghanistan were our NATO partners and allies.
I would have to go back and check that number, but I take your word for it.
Let me just assert that hundreds and hundreds of service members from, as you put it, Australia and the United Kingdom, as well as many other of our allies, served, fought, and died alongside us. So I'm just going to simply say, in terms of our reliance on our partnerships, I'll agree with the chairman that at a moment when Russia and China, North Korea, and Iran are coming closer together and delivering a bedeviling lethality in this ongoing war in Iran, for which we don't have a clear strategy or clear answers, our better strategy would be to partner more closely with Ukraine, dig in deeper with our real values-based allies, our treaty allies in the Western Pacific and in Europe, and together find a path out of this, rather than berating them and bullying them for not coming along in a war they were not consulted about or briefed on before it began. I look forward to a second round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
What started as a routine Senate hearing quickly turned tense after Senator Chris Coons confronted Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth over delayed military funding for Ukraine. And as the questioning intensified, the hearing became a much larger debate about NATO, America's allies, and the future of U.S. support for Ukraine. The exchange began when Coons pointed out that Congress had already approved $400 million in military aid for Ukraine months earlier after President Trump signed the fiscal year defense appropriations bill in January. But despite repeated bipartisan requests from lawmakers, the Department of Defense had still not spent the money. Coons pressed Hegseth directly, asking when lawmakers would finally receive a clear spending plan and whether the administration intended to fully commit those funds to Ukraine's defense against Russia. Hegseth responded by saying the funds had been released from the Secretary of Defense office and that the Pentagon would work with military leadership in Europe to allocate the money appropriately. But Coons clearly was not satisfied with that answer. The tension escalated when Coons reminded Hegseth that the funding had already been law since January and accused the administration of dragging its feet at a critical moment in the war. And politically, this is where the hearing became far more significant than just one budget dispute. Coons framed the delay as a dangerous signal to Russian President Vladimir Putin, especially at a time when European allies have increased their own support for Ukraine and committed billions toward weapons and defense assistance. But the hearing also exposed a deeper divide inside American foreign policy. On one side, lawmakers like Coons argue that strengthening Ukraine and maintaining close relationships with NATO allies is essential to countering Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. They see the war in Ukraine as part of a broader global struggle involving democracy, alliances, and international stability. On the other side, Hegseth repeatedly emphasized burden sharing and argued that America's allies often place political limitations on military operations while relying too heavily on U.S. leadership and resources. One of the strongest moments of the exchange came when Coons referenced the sacrifices made by NATO allies during the war in Afghanistan, specifically mentioning Danish soldiers who fought and died alongside American troops. That moment shifted the tone of the hearing because it moved the conversation away from spending numbers and toward loyalty, partnership, and America's global role. Coons essentially argued that U.S. alliances are not transactional relationships built only around money. Instead, he framed NATO as one of the most important and successful defense partnerships in modern history, built through shared sacrifice and long-term cooperation. Hegseth, however, pushed back by arguing that while foreign troops fought bravely alongside Americans, political restrictions imposed by allied governments often limited military effectiveness on the battlefield. The exchange highlighted one of the biggest debates happening in Washington right now. Should the United States continue taking the lead in defending global alliances and funding overseas conflicts, or should allies carry a greater share of the responsibility? That question sits at the center of the ongoing debate over Ukraine, NATO, and America's role in the world. And judging by the tension during this hearing, that debate is only becoming more intense. Subscribe to Capitol Breakdown HQ for more congressional hearing breakdowns and political analysis.